Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, good to have you again.
Always good to be with you, Nasim, and Eid Mubarak.
Yeah, and likewise, in Mubarak to you. So I want to begin, of course, as usual, with the situation in Gaza, but this week, paying particular attention to the Israeli Supreme Court ruling that Israel has no obligation to allow food and aid into Gaza. So we'll discuss that, then move to one of the big stories from last week, the anti-Hamas protests that sparked in Gaza. And then Netanyahu, in seeking to ethnically cleanse Palestinians, he's now tasked Mossad to find a country that will house Palestinians in Gaza. So we'll discuss that as well as key stories from the region, and finishing off with the crackdown in the US, which is ongoing and seems to be becoming more of a police state as far as I can see. So, returning back to Gaza, the wanton Israeli violence has continued. The latest war crimes is that 15 Palestinian paramedics and rescue workers, including UN employees, were killed by Israeli forces, and I quote, one by one, according to a UN report. So Jonathan Whittle, who is the head of OCHA, which is the UN organization investigating and documenting Israeli war crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories, said that 7 days ago, civil defense and ambulances arrived at the scene. One by one, they were hit, they were struck, their bodies were gathered and buried in this mass grave. So while all this is going on, it seems like every branch of the Israeli government is in lockstep in the execution of this genocide. And the latest example of that is the Israeli Supreme Court, which ruled that it has no obligation to allow food and aid into Gaza. So I want to begin with your thoughts on the Israeli Supreme Court's decision to issue that judgment.
Well, what the Israeli Supreme Court has essentially ruled is that international law does not apply to Israel, that Israel is, in effect, free to act as it pleases. And many people will see this as perhaps some kind of radical departure from traditional Israeli jurisprudence regarding its occupation. But there is, in fact, nothing new, because we need to understand that the Israeli judicial system has been an integral component of the occupation from the very outset. There have been very, very, very few examples where the Israeli Supreme Court has actually ruled against the Israeli state, and it has, for over half a century, consistently deferred to the government, and particularly to the Israeli military and security forces. It has legitimized torture. It has legitimized deportations. It has legitimized ethnic cleansing. It has legitimized house demolitions. There is virtually nothing, there's virtually no Israeli practice in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip that the Supreme Court has not signed off on. And what we're seeing now is, in effect, a further extension of that jurisprudence, where the Israeli Supreme Court has ruled that Israel is not bound by any of the obligations that it is, in fact, formally required to, and that it is free to impose this genocidal siege on the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip. And this goes back also, for example, to the Israeli attitude towards the Fourth Geneva Conventions, which, of course, is a matter of law. These are the Fourth Geneva Conventions, deal with the protection of civilian populations in time of war, and specifically with how an occupying power is supposed to deal with the population it occupies. And Israel's position has consistently been that, on the one hand, the Fourth Geneva Conventions do not apply to it, but at the same time, that it does respect the humanitarian provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention. A, it has never specified what those humanitarian provisions are, and B, it has violated each and every single one of them. over the decades. And the larger context, of course, here is that Israel, makes these anodyne statements of we respect the humanitarian provisions or we are not bound by them. And then you get Israel's sponsors and allies and apologists and flunkies basically extolling the awesome independence of the Israeli judiciary, taking satisfaction with these statements in order to ensure that Israel can continue to act with total impunity, with zero accountability, and with the full and, in fact, growing support of Western governments. I mean, we need to understand that the genocide is now reaching its very peak during the past month and a half. And I think it's fair to say that Israel's relations with most Western governments have never been better.
And in its judgment, it said that the laws of belligerent occupation does not apply in Gaza, which is strikingly at odds with the decision passed by the International Court of Justice last July, which clearly stated that Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank is illegal, and it demanded that Israel end its occupation and the international community assist in ending its occupation. And also it also comes on the back of the fact that there is an ongoing I would say a war between disagreement between Benjamin Netanyahu and the judiciary, and Netanyahu, as many know, is seeking to overhaul the judiciary and strip some of the powers of the Supreme Court. And for many, this is seen as, there's a disagreement between Israel's judiciary and the other branches and Netanyahu. And you see that sometimes with even US commentators, someone like US commentators like Bernie Sanders, who consistently blames Netanyahu and never mentions the fact that this is Israel. It's not Netanyahu. All the branches of the Israeli government, as I said in my opening, are in lockstep with this genocide.
Yes.
And this idea that just because there's a conflict between the government and the judiciary, that somehow they're not in on this genocide together is laughable.
Well, you can, in response to your question, you can think of the Israeli state as a kind of crime family, where various kingpins are jostling for power and position vis-a-vis each other, but at the same time are absolutely united in maintaining their racket vis-a-vis the outside world, in maintaining their control of all the various criminal activities that they're engaged in. I think that's a pretty fair way to look at it. Yes, Netanyahu and the judiciary, on the one hand, are at absolute loggerheads, are at each other's throats about the future shape of the Israeli state, but at the same time are completely united when it comes to Israeli policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And you mentioned the International Court of Justice. Yes, it has already on multiple occasions ruled that the international laws and treaties that Israel's highest judicial organ has now formally rejected, that they apply to the occupied territories, which means that whatever a national court may think or state about this is completely irrelevant. And at the same time, going all the way back to the late 1960s, the United Nations Security Council has on multiple occasions reached a similar verdict that the Fourth Geneva Conventions apply as a matter of incontestable principle, and that Israel is under an absolute obligation to respect and implement each and every one of the articles of that convention, and cannot pick and choose and claim that it is respecting some of them without ever defining which ones they are, while violating all of them.
And in Gaza itself, the big story from there is the protest that erupted last week against Hamas. When I say large numbers are ranging from 500 to 1,000 in a place called Beit Lahiya in northern Gaza. I guess, the question is this a random event, or do you see this as being orchestrated? Because let's not forget that Israel, from the outset, one of his narrative has been that we are saving the Palestinians from Hamas. But a number of Palestinians who did take part in the protest, they said that we are not protesting, we are protest. We are not against resistance. We are against the war. We are against Hamas. We're against Israel. We're just against the killing and the destruction. We just want this war to end. That seems to be the overriding sentiment from what I gauged from the statements by the protesters. So going back to the question, is this orchestrated? Do you see this as being a random event? How do you view this protest that's erupting over the past week?
Well, it's entirely plausible that it's both. I mean, going back to how these demonstrations erupted, Israel, of course, resumed its genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip with increased intensity in the northern Gaza Strip last week. It then issued evacuation orders for, among others, Beit Lahiya, one of the northernmost population centers in the Gaza Strip. In response, it appears that a bunch of clan leaders and notables in Beit Lahiya called for a demonstration, which was primarily an anti-war demonstration, basically against, the continuation of the genocide. Now, we don't know whether it was intended as such or whether perhaps it was coordinated with Hamas as such in order to ensure that Hamas will not intervene to try to prevent these demonstrations from taking place. And then what happened is that when these demonstrations erupted, which initially were initially had about a few hundred participants, according to most media that have covered them, there were a number of slogans basically calling for an end to genocide and peace. And then there were also additional slogans specifically critical of Hamas, criticizing Hamas, condemning Hamas, calling on Hamas to, on the one hand, relinquish power. And on the other, some people were basically suggesting that Hamas should essentially capitulate and accept whatever Israel and the mediators and Western countries demanded of it, because in their view, that if Hamas were to capitulate and accept all the demands being made of it in terms of releasing the captives, giving up its weapons, and so on, in their view, that would lead Israel to terminate its genocidal campaign against the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip. One can, of course, fully understand why people who have been subjected to a year and a half of the most brutal, sadistic military campaigns in modern history would be desperate for this to end, and how they might also believe or be led to believe that if only Hamas would comply with all the demands being made of it, that this campaign would stop. Unfortunately, to the extent that they believe that to be the case, they're wrong, because you now have the Israeli government. I mean, if any further proof were needed, openly speaking about, openly advocating, openly organizing for the mass forcible expulsion of all Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. Hamas, anti-Hamas, whatever the case may be. I think these demonstrations then spread to a number of other locations. Hardly the popular uprising that they have been portrayed as in some media and accounts. And I think those, you have basically two groups, several attitudes toward these demonstrations. You have some which are looking at them as legitimate expressions of, at the very least, the opinions of those participating in them, while at the same time recognizing that rivals and enemies of Hamas, perhaps Mohammed Dahlan, the former Fatah leader who's based in the United Arab Emirates, perhaps Israel, perhaps its Palestinian Authority, others may be working to encourage these demonstrations in order to put pressure on Hamas. But even if that is the case, I don't think that should detract from that there is at least some part of Palestinian public opinion in the Gaza Strip that is genuinely, committed to an agenda of ending, on the one hand, ending, of course, Israel's genocidal military campaign, and at the same time, genuinely believes that if Hamas capitulates, that this could lead to such an outcome. Then you have others, of course, who view these demonstrations as undermining the Palestinian capacity to resist, who see first and foremost, let's say, nefarious hands at work in these demonstrations. And then you have, on the other hand, of course, the Israel apologists and flunkies, for the most part, people who have said not a word about over a year of demonstrations against the Israeli government for its refusal to negotiate in good faith about a cessation of hostilities and exchange of captives. People who have turned a blind eye to anything that doesn't suit their agenda that's happening within Israel or that's being done by Israel, who were all of a sudden lauding this as a popular uprising, or at least initially they were, they switched from everyone and everything is Hamas to now everyone and everything is against Hamas. And it seems they then realized that it becomes difficult to continue promoting and advocating for genocide if you're at the same time making the claim that all the people whose slaughter you're advocating for are actually enemies of Hamas. So then you began to see them kind of backtrack. Well, yes, they're against Hamas, but they're not calling for an immediate unconditional release of the captives. Actually, these are organizations demonstrations they would claim that are being organized by Hamas itself in order to fool us and so on. So it's become kind of a PR mess for them. Yes, we want all these people slaughtered, but at the same time claiming all these people are actually supporting our agenda and so on. So we'll see how that pans out in the coming days. But just getting back to the demonstrations themselves, I do think they are significant, or at the very least, they are not insignificant. But I certainly wouldn't go so far as to say that they constitute a popular uprising that can transform the domestic political reality within the Gaza Strip. And we have to bear in mind also that it appears that when Israel resumed its genocidal military campaign in full scale last week in the Gaza Strip, it was very much targeting not so much Hamas military cadres and facilities, but primarily political targets and the civil administration of the Gaza Strip, the government, precisely in order to create the kind of chaos within which we are now seeing these kinds of demonstrations erupting.
But of course, as you mentioned, understandably, Gazans are tired of this war. But the reason, going back to your point about the ceasefire, but the reason why there is no ceasefire is because of Israel. And we've covered this a number of times here. Israel broke the ceasefire over weeks ago, refusing to enter into the second phase of the negotiations. And Hamas, according to the latest report, is also now seeking to resume discussions on ceasefire and has allegedly agreed to free 5 living Israeli hostages in exchange for a 50-day ceasefire. It's worth saying that and also reviewing how we came to this point, and also mentioning the fact that usually, because many pro advocates of Israel have exploited this and suggested that there's a huge Hamas is cracking down on Palestinian protesters, presumably it is, and pointing out that even in democracies, in wars, during times of wars, you have martial law. And what do people expect in a region or occupied Gaza, which is suffering genocide? I mean, I don't know what kind of expectations they have. What would a democracy do when it's subjected to genocide? Would it allow opposition and critics to protest on streets? Given that usually during a war situation, what we see is countries imposing martial law on their populations. So I think there's a real unfair assessment on exactly what's happening in Gaza. Of course, there'll be protests, but the protest is largely aimed at not just Hamas, but also the Israelis, because these are populations that have been subjected to a genocide. And it seems Hamas is seeking to enter into negotiation, given that Israel was the main actor which broke this negotiation in the first place.
Well, two separate issues, just to continue on these demonstrations. Yes, there are reports that Hamas has cracked down on them, arrested people, even killed several of the protest leaders. These reports are emerging almost exclusively from radical right-wing media, so I don't consider them confirmed as of yet. But as you mentioned, well, first of all, I mean, Hamas has been ruling the Gaza Strip hegemonically since 2007, and indeed has not allowed any significant challenges to its rule since then, just exactly the same way that the Palestinian Authority has ruled the Gaza Strip, even if I don't think you've had quite the same level of repression in the Gaza Strip that you've had in the West Bank. But that notwithstanding, it's hardly surprising that, particularly in the current circumstances, Hamas will seek to crush anything that it sees as a significant challenge to its continued rule, even as Hamas has already, for many months, expressed its willingness to terminate any role it has in the governance and administration of the Gaza Strip, provided that any new alternative is done in consultation with it and enjoys its consent. Now, regarding the negotiations, as you mentioned, there never was a ceasefire. There was a suspension of hostilities, which Israel repeatedly honored in the breach. Israel refused to fulfill many of its commitments under the first phase of the ceasefire. Hamas, on the whole, did not respond to that because Hamas's key objective was reaching the second stage of the January agreement, because the second stage requires a durable cessation of hostilities. Problem is that Israel, from the outset, announced its refusal to enter into negotiations for the second stage. And even though the January agreement specifies that neither party can resume hostilities so long as negotiations for a second phase are continuing, what we saw is that at the end of the first phase, Israel not only reimposed its siege on the Gaza Strip, but reimposed a much more comprehensive siege than it has previously. There's now no water, no electricity, no fuel, etc., entering the Gaza Strip. And at the same time, resumed more recently a full-scale military campaign where on the first day you had 400 people slaughtered in the space of 24 hours, nearly half of them children. Arguably the bloodiest day in the occupied territories since 1967, let alone since October 2023. It's now engaged in a massive ground assault in the southern Gaza Strip, in the town of Rafah, and apparently has ordered the entire population of Rafah to order them out of that town. And the key issue now is that Hamas is flexible about extending the first phase, about conducting additional exchanges of captives, as you just mentioned, its core demand is that any compromises or concessions that it makes regarding the immediate resumption of the first phase of the agreement is organically connected to meaningful negotiations about the second phase, meaning that they lead to a durable cessation of hostilities. And absent guarantees of that, Hamas has apparently concluded that it's better off not accepting any so-called bridging proposals and insisting on the implementation of what the parties already agreed to in January. Israel's position, largely with the support of the United States, is that, the agreement that was agreed in January is somehow no longer meaningful, that the commitments made in January, with hindsight, actually mean nothing. And Israel is now making all kinds of proposals about, basically, if Hamas capitulates, if it surrenders all the captives, if it disarms, and if the Hamas leadership leaves the Gaza Strip, then Israel will reciprocate by forcibly expelling the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip. So it's a non-starter, unfortunately.
And like we've been saying over the year, the manner in which Israel has executed this war of annihilation is with the goal of seeking to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from their territory. And this has been the main policy, especially after Trump has announced that. And Netanyahu is seeking to enforce that. And they've approached a number of countries, all of whom have rejected the plan. And now Netanyahu has tasked Mossad, of all people, of finding a country where they can forcefully settle Palestinians. This seems to be really coming from a position of weakness, I guess, a recognition that we have to seek alternative means. When I say alternative means, I guess this looking into some of seeking to employ the dark art of politics to make countries accept large numbers of Palestinians to come into their countries. That's where we're heading at the moment, because no country, a right-minded country, even the US under Trump, who has backed and advocated for this plan, would not allow Palestinians from Gaza to go to the US. So I don't see how, without employing Mossad, the dark art of politics, how would you even implement such a strategy? And Netanyahu has tasked Mossad now to seeking finding a solution to what is, for the Israelis, an impossible task.
Well, I mean, how is this going to work? Okay, Rwanda, after its sordid deal with Great Britain fell apart, can take perhaps a few thousand, will perhaps accept to take a few thousand Palestinians. Argentina, led by this lunatic, will perhaps offer to take a few hundred, and one can think of a few other countries. So, if Israel makes arrangements with other countries to take 10,000 or even 100,000 or even 250,000 Palestinians, which I don't see happening, by the way, if we're talking about such numbers. Um, that still doesn't solve its problem. For Israel to achieve its objectives, it has to engage in the mass forcible expulsion of the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, and for that matter, from the West Bank, through the use of overwhelming, brutal violence. And that is exactly what it is doing now. Its problem is that the two main Arab states that are supposed to open their gates to receive all these Palestinians so that the Gaza Strip and West Bank are safe for Jewish settlement again, have been categorical that they will not participate in this criminal enterprise, primarily for reasons of their own. But that's why it's not going to work. So Israel's alternative, I think, is one where Palestinians gradually begin to try to trickle out, some 1 to 200,000 already have to Egypt since October 2023. And then, you'll get perhaps Israel supplying rubber dinghies to the Gaza Strip so that they can try to cross the Mediterranean the way Syrian refugees and African refugees have in recent years. But the idea that there's kind of a silver bullet where some tin pot dictator is going to stand up and say, yes, send them here, problem solved, that's simply not going to happen.
Yeah, completely agree. Let's turn our attention to some of the stories from the region. First of all, Iran. Iran has said that it's open to indirect talks with the US. That follows Trump issuing threats to Iran, saying that if it does not agree to a nuclear deal, he will bomb Iran. And that's, for viewers who don't follow this story, it's quite puzzling statement to make, because Trump, in his first administration, he was the one who torpedoed the nuclear deal that was agreed by his predecessor, not just President Barack Obama, but also the EU, France, UK, and Russia, a number of Western countries. And he was the one who basically undermined and dismantled this nuclear deal. Now he wants a nuclear deal and is issuing threats. And Iran, as we know, no country for that matter responds to threat in any shape or form. And the supreme leader has come out and said that bombing Iran or threatening Iran would spark a retaliation from the country. So I guess, what's your assessment of Trump's threat and Iran's response? And also, given that we've been here before, why is Trump seeking a deal that's already was in place, and he was the one who broke it in the first place?
Well, this is Trump. I mean, he basically, in his first term, also, called for a renunciation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, then replaced it with something that was, for all intents and purposes, identical, and called it the greatest trade agreement in economic history. And he's now dismantling it again. With respect to Iran, I think several things are going on. First of all, it's quite clear that there is factional warfare in Washington within the Trump administration between those whose priority is, if not an agreement, at least some kind of modus vivendi between the United States and Iran to ensure that Israel does not drag the United States into a direct and very costly military confrontation with Iran. And on the other hand, you have kind of the neocons and the war hawks and the rest of it who would like to see nothing better than a further escalation of tensions with Iran and a direct confrontation between the United States and Iran. And you see kind of two agendas where one group is saying that the purpose of negotiations should be to ensure that Iran does not develop a nuclear weapon, and that the lifting of sanctions is the leverage that can be used to achieve such an agreement. So basically a formula similar to that in the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement that, as you noted, Trump unilaterally renounced. And then those who are opposed to an agreement are putting forward objectives designed to be rejected by the Iranians, basically saying, no, it's not just about you not developing nuclear weapons. You have to systematically dismantle each and every component of your entire nuclear program. In other words, you can't even have a civilian nuclear program. In other words, you have to renounce all the rights you already have under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, rights that every other state in the world has. And unless you renounce those, there's going to be war. Getting back to Trump, I think, this is typical. It's all the bluster and threats and so on, so that when he makes an agreement that contains significant American concessions, he can say, well, actually, the only reason we got to these agreements is not because the United States finally how do you call it, finally accepted reality, but it's because the other side capitulated to my threats. The problem, as you correctly noted, is that no government wants to be seen as capitulating to a bully out of principle, and because when you capitulate to a bully, you're simply whetting his appetite. And so the challenge now is that it does appear that Trump is serious about negotiations, but he has to now find a way to persuade the Iranians to accept negotiations without all this kind of, cowboy talk and bluster that is going to make it impossible for the Iranians to reciprocate.
I can pick up on your point about there being two factions in the US. Um, I think that was clearly demonstrated by discussion we had last week about the private conversation between Vance and before the bombing of Yemen. Sorry, and there in that communication, Vance, President, the Deputy President of the US, he clearly said that he is not on board with the idea of bombing Yemen, and his main argument was that they have not really sold this argument to the American public, and it looks bad for America's image in the world. And given that the U.S., Trump in particular, has won his election partly because of this idea of America first, and we will not be fighting someone else's war, foreign wars, and this is again seen as another case of business as usual, and no political analyst worth his weight in salt will say that America bombing Iran is in the interest of the US. This is not in the interest of the US. This is really in the interest of, first and foremost, Israel. And you can make an argument that it's also Saudi Arabia, UAE, some of the other Gulf countries, but they're actually getting along with Iran at the moment. If you look at Saudi Arabia, they have a good relation. So does the UAE. So does Qatar. The only country in the Middle East who has an issue with Iran is Israel. So American
And now
public is not
Syria
going
as
to accept
well.
that. And now it's yeah. So Vance is onto something. We spoke about this last week, but details of this communication has come out and shown that there is clearly a division within Trump administration itself at the highest levels where they don't seem to be seeing eye to eye on Trump's foreign threats and campaigns to want to bomb one country after another.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, there are also factional differences within the Iranian elite, where you have one group that is saying that Iran desperately needs an agreement and should respond positively to Trump's gestures because it needs the lifting of sanctions and all the rest of it. And another group who's saying, been there, done that. The Americans have gone out of their way to demonstrate that they're not to be trusted. They've gone out of their way to demonstrate that any commitments they make are not worth the paper they're written on or the ink they're written with, and therefore we shouldn't waste our time on reaching another agreement with the Americans that essentially will be honored mainly in the breach. But getting back to your question, yes, if you look at the Gulf states, of course, if they could wake up tomorrow morning and find out that the Iranian government has been overthrown and that its military capabilities have been obliterated, they would like nothing better. The problem for them is that they recognize that what is required to achieve this will extract a huge human and material and economic cost from them as well, because Iran has already demonstrated its capacity to hit them and hit very hard. And it's in that context. And the first Trump administration's refusal to significantly back them up during its first period in office, that these states began a thaw in their relations with Iran. And so we have a completely different equation now, where during the first Trump administration, the United States, Israel, and the conservative GCC states were very closely aligned on their agenda vis-a-vis Iran. That's no longer the case. The U.S. is, let's say, speaking out of both sides of its mouth, and is certainly no longer unified on an anti-Iranian agenda. Israel has become even more extreme because it feels that it now has a realistic prospect of attacking and weakening Iran. And the Gulf states now view Israel as not only a security partner, but also as a regional pyromaniac, and are in effect begging the Americans to keep their Israeli proxy in check. And from an American point of view, again, some people in this administration believe that it's in the U.S. national security interest to confront Iran, or believe that Israel's interests should dominate the American Middle East policy. And others say, you know, this is not a vital American interest that is at stake, and to the extent that there are American interests at stake, it's to improve our relationship with Iran rather than engage in a costly confrontation with it.
I think the bottom line when it comes to a lot of these Gulf countries is the recognition that we live in the Middle East. We have to live with Iran. You don't have to live with Iran, and they're willing to make these concessions. They're even willing to make concessions with Israel. They're willing to live side by side with Israel if it agrees to Palestinian self-determination
Excuse me.
and its occupation. I don't think it's willing to live within Israel that's continuing to commit genocide and also expand its borders. Now it's been bombing Syria, it's bombing Lebanon, and these are the two countries which have newly formed governments. And one of the countries, of course, I mentioned, is Syria. They formed a government, and this new government is seen as kind of a litmus test to see which way Ahmed al-Sharaz will take the country. And by all key analysts have said that this is a moderate government that has been set up. And also, they have appointed a Grand Mufti, this Grand Mufti of Syria is again seen as a very moderate, uniting figure who was very critical of HTS and all the jihadi groups. They condemned all the jihadi groups. So here you have a government in Syria that's trying to basically put a country back together again, and making all its different parts and constituencies feel safe. And then at the same time, you have Lebanon, which is again has formed a new government trying to stitch the country back together again. All this is happening, but at the same time, Israel is bombing both countries. So how does the Middle East, I guess, find any kind of stability when you have a country like Israel bombing one country after another? And I refer also to an article in The Economist that came out the other day, where he basically said that Israel's hubris is going to be its undoing.
Yeah, I mean, the Economist is not the only one that has suggested that Israel's hubris may lead it to overextending itself with resources and capacities that it simply does not possess over the longer term. I mean, there are now reports of something like 50% of reservists refusing to report for duty. Uh, you know, um, Israel likes to think of itself as a global superpower, whereas in fact it is a regional power whose hegemony and dominance is a function, I would argue, of two things: A, the weakness of others, and B, the support it is getting from the most powerful states in human history. So its ability to dominate the Middle East and establish its hegemony is more a function of the strength or weakness of others, rather and only secondarily of its own capacities and its own strength. I mean, it's a small state with a fairly small population, and the idea that it can kind of endlessly dominate the region while at the same time ensuring both the continued weakness of its adversaries and the continued support of its external backers, I think is will prove to be an illusion. Now, the problems in Syria and Lebanon that you've addressed. In Syria, yes, a new government has been formed. Apparently, all the key ministries are being held by close associates of Ahmed al-Sharia. And so, on the one hand, there's the real challenge of inclusion and of pluralism and so on. But at the same time, I think the two main challenges this new government is facing is unless the Western countries began systematically lifting the sanctions that they placed on Syria under the pretext of their opposition to the former regime, this government won't be able to do anything. And unless these Western states basically start exercising pressure on Israel to stop bombing Syria and to withdraw from Syrian territory rather than supporting the expansion of Israel's military campaign in Syria and supporting Israel's continued seizure of additional Syrian territory, this government can't achieve anything and won't last and will collapse under its own weight. And it's quite clear what's going on here. The Western states are using their sanctions on Syria, not in order to reach certain objectives regarding their own relations with Syria, although that's part of it as well. Their main objective is to ensure Syrian submission to Israel. Lebanon is a similar but also different story because in Lebanon now, you have, as you mentioned, a new president, a new prime minister, a new government, and their weakness and inability to defend their own state's sovereignty is being demonstrated in the most visible fashion by Israel on a daily basis. And the only strategy that these new leaders in Lebanon have is to appeal to the United States, which is the one enabling all this Israeli conduct, to reign in Israel, to appeal to France and so on, and they're going to fail. And Israel can only push them so far before Hezbollah will conclude that despite its weakened and reduced capacities, that it has no option but to strike back. This may very well be precisely what Israel wants, so it can engage in a new campaign of vandalism against Lebanon. We'll have to see how that works out in the coming weeks. But, Israel is now in a kind of triumphalist mood where it feels apparently that every morning it should bomb another state just as a matter of principle.
I think last week, one of Trump's senior officials, he said that they're seeking normalization between Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Syria. So based on what he said, I think you're correct in assuming that the lifting of sanctions against Syria, I think, will be tied to some kind of normalization with Israel. But we'll have to wait and see. Let's finish, though, with I think we finished on this topic last week, but not in detail. It's just the sheer draconian measures that have been adopted by Trump to crack down on pro-Palestinian activists. These are green card holders. Now there's dozens who are facing deportation, and we saw really horrific images of ICE officers wearing masks, pulling people off the streets. And there's been a huge backlash against it. I mean, people who generally support Israel, they're coming out on social media saying this: if supporting Israel means this, I am not on board this. This meaning this level of draconian, Stasi-like policies to take people off the streets. And it seems like Trump is probably going a bit too far, even for many of the backers of Israel. And just this week, an academic institution in the US, American Association of University Professors, they've issued a letter against this kind of kidnapping, I would say, and deportation of pro-Palestinian activists, some of whom, let's not forget, are simply being deported or arrested for writing articles and blogs in support of Palestine and critical of Israel.
I mean, what's really so remarkable about all this is that none of these individuals are being targeted for criticizing the United States or for negative views they've expressed about the country in which they're living. It's all about Israel. In other words, you can call for, you can criticize the United States if you're in the United States. You can even call for the destruction of the United States and whatnot, condemn it as much as you want. But if you criticize Israel, you're done. You get picked up off the street by plainclothes masked thugs, sent off to some maximum security prison in Louisiana. The government will simply ignore any ruling by any judge in any court because for a certain class of U.S. politicians, Israeli interests stand above U.S. interests, stand far above U.S. interests, and they will accept and absorb anything you say about their own country. But God forbid you criticize this foreign proxy, and they will mobilize everything within their power to make an example out of you. I'll leave it at that because there are many more details also about kind of the willing compliance of so many university administrators and so on. They've been basically waiting for this, and they see it as an opportunity rather than a threat. But I'm sure, unfortunately, there will be many more such incidents, which we'll have the opportunity to discuss in the coming weeks.
Thanks, Mouin. I'm sure we'll return to this topic once again. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani, and you've been listening to or watching our weekly review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin. Thank you for tuning in. See you next week. Bye-bye.